everybody, and welcome back to the You Didn't Catch That podcast. This is episode 14. And Noah, you didn't catch DragonHeart, the 1996 movie that probably came out before you were born?
Wow, that
I
movie.
remember what year you were born.
It did come out before I was born. I did miss that movie that came out before I was born. I would not be around on this earth for another 2 years. I think that you would not be around for even another year after that, if my calculations are correct. I'll check my numbers.
Nope, 98.
98. Yep. So wait, we were born in the same year? Okay.
Yeah, I'm a year behind you in school simply because my birthday's in October and the cutoff date in Indiana is August 5th. So I was not allowed to start school for another year after.
Oy. It's wonderful. We'll let Malcolm Gladwell or whatever his name is sort out the implications of that. No, I hadn't caught DragonHeart. That was not something that ended up in front of me.
Well, it was something that ended up in front of me, and quite often, because, again, my family was really into certain things. Mm-hmm. My aunt loves fairy stories and dragon stuff, and The Labyrinth and DragonHeart were two of her biggest things when I was a kid.
Okay.
By the time I was born, she already had the VHSs, or one of my grandparents did, and she borrowed them a lot. And when she would babysit me, she would put them on. And so I've been watching this movie since I was born, for as long as I've been watching Star Wars and Lord of the Rings.
Okay, fair enough. I mean,
the last time I've seen this movie before the rewatch I did for this episode was a couple years ago, because I haven't had a VHS player in a couple years, so I haven't been able to watch it without one.
That is
because I didn't realize it got put on DVD. I just assumed it was one of those movies you just had to find the VHS for, because it always had such a small cult following. Until I realized they made sequels.
And how many? And man, they made so many sequels. They keep pumping those out. I remember
Tremors.
I did in some of the research I was doing. I think I saw that one of the big names behind the film, one of the big creators, was saying something to the effect of, they keep putting those out there in the hopes of maybe eventually making a remake of the first one. Just keep the name buzzing. It'll just pump out a few more direct-to-DVD ones. So why did you...
To be fair, I'm pretty sure the person who made the third one was really excited to work on it because they loved the first movie. I'm almost positive I read that in a interview article somewhere, but it's been a while, so don't go based just on my memory.
So
the third one was first coming out, it was hot shit.
I mean, I can believe that
my circles.
I'd believe that these are like passion projects that turn out horribly. That's most of, fantasy film, and it's fun to see that. Even Peter Jackson only has a 50% run with his fantasy films. So why did you decide to share it then? What was it about this that felt like I had to catch it?
Well, we're doing a dragon month.
Oh yeah.
And when I think dragons, we're doing a dragon month theme of just sharing dragon shit with each other. We figured since we're coming back and we did an episode that was on something really serious and relevant, such as Tuca and Birdie, it was fine if we went a little fantastical for the next couple of weeks. So, dragons! Which I personally adore. It's my favorite mythological creature.
It went so well that we're going to have a content warning for a section later on. It's so lighthearted. And we only kind of face-planted on the first entry of the lighthearted month.
I just want to say, listen, when I think dragons, I think DragonHeart. This was the movie that introduced the concept of dragons to me. I didn't know what a dragon was until I watched this movie, because this is literally the first thing I have ever seen with a dragon in it. And then I would be shown like Disney movies, like the Sword in the Stone and such, with the witch who could turn into a dragon later on. And my view on dragons would grow past this. But when I think dragon, I think DragonHeart.
This was your primary dragon sort of experience. This sort of forms your archetypical dragon. This is the dragon to which all others are measured. Yes.
Basically, and it's Sean Connery's voice. So I'm nearly positive this is why I like older Sean Connery movies and not younger Sean Connery movies, because I didn't know who he was past this voice for a few years.
Oh boy. You know, for me, I can't think of what my like archetypical dragon would have been growing up, because the truth of the matter is, though I had this like, there's a recurring motif in my childhood of wanting to like check out stuff that seemed really interesting, but never actually going out and doing so. Like, I wanted to check out what like stuff like high fantasy dragon adventure stuff would have been like, but I never actually went out and actively found stuff that had that in it. I mean, so like the biggest dragons in my childhood would have been like Smaug in The Hobbit when my dad read it to me, or probably in terms of like per hour watch, the dragons on Dragon Tales were the dominant dragons in my youth.
See, mine were this movie and the Never-Ending Story.
Oh.
My two faves. My two biggest dragon inspirations. And it's funny because DragonHeart plays on Western dragon themes, and Never-Ending Story uses Eastern dragon themes. So it was two completely different dragons.
And hey, fans of Never-Ending Story, I have good news for you. I also didn't see that one when I was a kid, so that will also be in the Dragon Month special. Look forward to that.
It's gonna be later in the month, but I'm excited about that one too. It also has some serious themes for a lighthearted movie, but what doesn't?
It turns out maybe dragons are kind of
serious.
Serious. Dang it. We thought we were going to have fun, but turns out dragons aren't just fun. They're also very serious.
I'm kind of sad because today is International Asexuality Day, and as someone who's demisexual, I haven't been out like in the open for that long about it, so I tried to celebrate these days even though COVID's still happening and I'm trapped in my house. But I couldn't find my purple asexuality shirt, which has the different sexualities on it, and then like a dragon on the cover. And I couldn't find it anywhere, so I'm just wearing my purple like flannel instead. One of my two purple flannels. Because I'm so sad I didn't get to wear it.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's a pity. Would have been quite fun. Would have looked great on the podcast.
But as for the prelude, let's get into the actual movie itself. Because there are many, many things to talk about with this movie.
Like, what did you think was going to be my reaction to this? Like, before we get into like the plot and all that actually did happen.
I'm not going to lie, I didn't expect you to like it.
Oh, really?
I did not expect you to like this movie. I figured we would be going in, you would be tearing into one of my childhood movies, and I would be laughing along because I've seen it so many times. I noticed all the bullshit in it. Like, I was making fun of it while I was rewatching it earlier with my boyfriend because, again, I've seen this movie so many times, I can't help but point out the nonsense. But it's still enjoyable for me, and I figured, even though it wasn't something I was expecting you to enjoy, I figured since it's a cult classic, you would still find it interesting enough to talk about.
Yeah.
And I figured you would enjoy the music in it because the music's so peaceful.
Oh, yeah.
I could fall asleep to that soundtrack.
Well,
so those were my only hopes of introducing the movie to you.
Well, certainly at least one of those rang true. So, want to get the ball rolling with As It Happened.
Yeah, so as it happened, the movie DragonHeart, the first one, is all about, well, you start with a peasant revolt at the very beginning of the movie. And the king is a tyrannical king who's going to handle them and slaughter them all. It is his plan to kill all of the peasants. That way they can't revolt anymore. And then he was just going to use the slave trade to bring more in. Yeah, that gets tossed on the rug really quietly. You start off with the prince training with an old knight who's been trained in the ways of King Arthur's men. And King Arthur's code for knights, which is all about honor and valor and what have you. And he's trying to make sure the prince becomes a better person than his father. He doesn't want another tyrant on the throne. And so when the king dies, the prince runs out to his father. And everyone assumes it's because the prince loves his father dearly. It's to grab the crown. Oopsie doopsie. We see a teenage girl around the same age as the teenage prince fall out of a burning house after trying to, like, escape it. And, she accidentally knocks into the prince and kills him while he clings to the crown.
You hate this.
So he's bleeding out, dying, and the old knight saves his life after basically spitting on his father's grave. He doesn't actually do that, but we all get the sense that's what he would have done if he could have at the time.
I believe his exact words are, "Just die."
Just die. That's the prince's last words to his father, which, mood. So basically,
turns out he was actually the worst.
Yeah, the knight takes the prince back to his mom, who is from the Celtic clans, which, only gets described as one large group and not actually explained or expanded upon at all. But because she's Celtic, she has a connection to the dragons, and her people used to worship them and work alongside them. So she takes her son to be healed by a dragon because she feels like her son is better than his father. She doesn't realize the truth. I can't blame her. He apparently hid it from everyone, though he was very out in the open about all of this nonsense.
Yeah, it does seem like
the dragon
we're not picking
the
up
dragon
on his
gives
cues.
half of his heart to the prince to save him. The prince then becomes a tyrant once he becomes king. The knight blames the dragon for corrupting the prince. The dragon blames the prince for being a corrupted asshole who lied to him. And the rest of the movie is about the knight hunting down and killing dragons. He kills the last two dragons, which is the scarred one, the last female, and then Draco, our main dragon of the movie, voiced by Sean Connery. And he and Draco trick a bunch of people to steal money from the kingdom and the king itself, and survive without having to kill each other. It doesn't go how they want.
It's just a big elaborate grift. It's
a big elaborate grift with some misconceptions around who the two of them are to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hilarious. It's really hilarious at some points, and then ridiculous at others.
In the big climax of the movie, Draco and Bowen, that's our main knight character, have sort of gotten together and have gotten some allies, gotten some friends along the way, and they've gotten sick and tired of this horrible, nasty prince and all his horrible nastiness, and they're like, you know what? We're getting rid of him. He's out. Peasant Revolt 2.0. We can do this. We can finish this. They get all the boys together. They get all the girls together. They go in. They have a great, grand old revolutionary time, except for the fact that the prince is immortal. Turns out when you're bound to a dragon,
Draco's killed.
You're immortal, so they have to kill Draco, and Draco knows this, and Draco's known this the whole time. He's just, been not sure about dying because he doesn't want to not go to heaven, and he's worried that he won't go to heaven because he accidentally made a nasty person immortal. But it turns out that by empowering Bowen, a nice guy, and Kara, a nice peasant girl, and co-leader of the rebellion, and also daughter of the first rebellion leader, are sufficiently good enough people.
And the person who killed the prince the first time.
And the person who killed the prince the first time. Let's not forget that. Excellent moves on her part, on all accounts. Those are sufficiently good stuff that after Draco gets stabbed, killing both himself and the prince, he gets to go off and go into the sky and live in dragon heaven, which happens to be the constellation Draco. Happy endings for everybody. And that's DragonHeart.
That's DragonHeart.
That's DragonHeart, man. Oh, my gravy.
All right, so let's start this off. So I'm looking on the outline, and as far as Raving Character Corner goes, you clearly want to talk about Draco, the star, best character ever, first, obviously. So Noah, what were your thoughts on Draco?
Oh,
Draco.
Now,
Whatever.
in writing the outline, I felt the need to collate our shared mutual experiences and impressions of the film. I think that calling him the star best character ever was a fair, a fair, healthy median between where we were both at with regards to this character.
Oh yeah.
I think Draco, obviously a star, obviously one of the most engaging characters. I read a critic quote that said something to the effect of, "The dragon is the most believable actor in the entire film," which is just about the best backhanded compliment I've ever seen. Oh, it's Sean Connery as a giant, very attractive dragon, having a very deep, intimate relationship with Dennis Quaid, who is Bowen. Like, it's hard not to be very profoundly engaged with what is going on here, even if I feel like, having read about the behind the scenes of the movie, there's some elements of like details and nuances in his character that I'm kind of sorry got kind of lost in later editions of the script. On the whole, though, solid dragon, rock solid dragon. What are your thoughts on the man?
Sean Connery is actually the only person they ever had planned to play the dragon. When they said that the dragon had to be unique, they immediately thought of his voice, and I have to agree, pretty fucking unique dragon. But I'm biased because, like I said, this was the epitome of what a dragon was supposed to be to me. Someone who could fight, but also have fun. And while he was understandable to mortal humans and their plights, he wasn't overly understanding. Like, he wasn't a fucking pushover. Mm-hmm. If you were good to him, he was good to you, and he saw goodness in people even when they made mistakes. Mm-hmm. And he also saw people for being trash even when they were. So if I had to give him one critique, making someone swear on their deathbed to follow a bunch of oaths, it's not the best time for that, because if their choice is between dying or saying a bunch of swears that they don't believe, they're gonna do the swears. They're gonna do the oaths. That's my only thing. Like, you should have known better, Draco. Like, I'm sorry, bud. It's my only complaint about you, though.
It does feel like everybody was giving the prince a lot of credit on a lot of angles here.
Yeah. Although it is Remus Lupin, so...
Yeah, I didn't even recognize him. He was such a scummy person. I told you, like, when I was watching this movie, it took me a long time to be like, oh, that's Remus Lupin, because he's just the worst, and I just couldn't process. Yeah, it sounds like Remus, but this guy is the worst.
Can I ask you, did you recognize Lucius Malfoy right away, though?
No, it took me ages. I was like, who is this man that seems familiar? My brain keeps wanting me to think that it's like Sirius Black. That can't be right. Something else is going on here. Why does he sound like a Monty Python character? But no, it was Lucius Malfoy playing, I don't know. He's like a less competent version of the second in command bad guy from The Princess Bride. Like, he's a very weird, incompetent, henchman character. That's his role here.
To be fair, out of all the henchmen, he does have the most brains, because he is the only one making sense when they're coming up with battle plans. But whatever. Back to Draco real quick, because we don't want to switch off topic. We have a couple minutes left on him. I do want to say the animation of his character, amazing. I wish all other dragons looked a little more like Draco.
Oh, really?
Like, yes, he is stylized, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And yes, the CGI has not held up, but what CGI does? Overall, he's a very fun character, and he's very expressive, especially anytime he's talking to literally anybody.
He's definitely profoundly expressive. That was sort of a thing that, I very much felt that in his design. And certainly there are elements that kind of like stuck out to me, like, if I want to get really nitpicky, his snout felt really short, but I understood why it was. It's got to look like, enough like a human face that they can like work with it in terms of like early CGI and shoot it, from enough of, variety of angles. I didn't love how expressive they made his hands. That seemed kind of like it contributed to how weirdly floaty most of his animation felt. But I did appreciate how very like how much expression that did convey, though. Like, it didn't look good, but it looked like they were trying to say a lot with him. And I felt like that's sort of what I think helps Draco in terms of like an animation effect, really. Well, like, because you're right, CGI doesn't hold up, and early CGI especially doesn't hold up. But this does still have a certain kind of life to it, which I appreciate, because the way that they'll like tilt him and have him flipping around Bowen as he's trying to keep eye contact with him while having a conversation, but also still be flying. Like, there's a lot of character emotion there. There's clearly a lot of animators having like a lot of skill put to the test to make this CGI critter feel as alive as possible. And they're doing an excellent job of it. You really do connect with him,
So
even if he
good.
is fake and old in terms of technical quality.
Yeah, but I mean, there are worse modern time dragons.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. It's.
I'm personally not a big fan of Game of Thrones dragons, but to each their own.
They do that. I'm starting to wonder if maybe Game of Thrones is cribbing some of their dragon shots from this movie. Just the few that I've seen that have cropped up online, because I also haven't seen Game of Thrones. But especially like the dragon rising in the background behind like a character in the foreground, that gets done here quite well. Not to the same effect, but very much like, oh, I see the trail of inspiration here. It's
But
yeah, no, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to add on to that. What I really appreciated is that he never felt lifeless.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
if you watch Aragon, Saphira feels lifeless a lot because she's not doing anything but standing behind Aragon in some of the shots.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I'm not trying to rag on that movie.
Mm-hmm.
I love that movie. There's a lot of shitty things in it, but there was moments where she didn't feel like a real living, breathing character. And I don't think that's ever the case in this movie.
Yes, that's absolutely the case. It's that, and like you said, it's that stylism that they add to him. He is.
Yes.
He's always moving. He's always expressing, and it doesn't always look like fully like in tune with what you imagine a dragon is supposed to look like. And a lot of the times, it is kind of genuinely cartoony, but like it is better than him having not moved much at all, having been kind of static in life there. And I think it kind of. If I may bring up a bit more of my research, because I'm just going to keep doing that, my research being spending too much time on Wikipedia between, now and last night when I first watched the film. One thing that I saw that one of the original creators of DragonHeart, saying Patrick Reed Johnson, who gets like a story credit and was originally set to direct before Universal got so excited about the film, they bumped him to get a more famous director.
Yeah.
Whoops, you made an idea that was too good for you to have the job. It happens, I guess, sometimes. Anyway, he
gotta love how production works.
He in an interview he did with IGN, and you can find this sort of linked on the DragonHeart Wikipedia page, and I really recommend going and like reading some of it, because he talks about a lot of like his interest in terms of like how he would tell a fantasy story, and he talks about how enamored he is with genre storytelling and special effects that aren't, where the goal isn't realism, where the goal is to have life. It's that verisimilitudinous sort of thing. Yes. Where it's not real, but it is a believable facsimile of life that you can invest in. He like cites E.T. specifically,
Use the audience's suspension of disbelief in your favor instead of relying on it to make up for what you lack.
Yeah, and it's funny because he uses that in favor of practical effects of the original plan to use like a use a Jim Henson Creature Shop puppet, and they had excellent Creature Shop technology, cutting edge stuff like live mouth animation that was going to be stuff that hadn't been done before, but they ended up going with CGI because Jurassic Park came out, and he was making all these arguments in favor of that. But I think that what we've seen here is CGI that does that. It is unreal, it is unbelievable, but it is still alive, and that's
enjoyable.
Cool. And it's enjoyable. Exactly. I quite appreciate that element of it. Some shots are cringe as all get out, but he's there and present in the film. Sometimes
I just want to point out one of the cringiest shots in the whole movie, but personally one of my favorites, when Draco takes his first dive after pretending to get hit with the trebuchet.
Oh my god.
he drops the trebuchet halfway down and then puts his hands out like he's a diver going straight into the water. And I appreciated that because it showed that he was having fun even while he was pretending to die.
Yeah, it's just...
He was gonna live, damn it, and he was gonna live like he wanted.
Just gonna live, have a great old time. You know who didn't always feel like they were alive and present on set? Bowen.
Are we Bowen? Okay. So, your thoughts on Bowen.
Bowen.
The Bowen.
Bowen.
The fantastic Bowen.
It does definitely feel like they tried to get, like, I guess it seems like when they pick Dennis Quaid, they're like, okay, you seem generic enough that you'd be believable doing just about anything as a fantasy protagonist, although not believable enough that people would actually look at you and be like, yeah, this makes sense. Just, like, fill the void needed to be filled. He's works pretty well with the CGI dragon, given that he probably never worked with CGI, prior to this. There are some shots where he's very clearly no idea what he's working with and is giving no energy to try and replicate that, probably because he's exhausted trying to give all the energy to fill a scene that should have 2 people in it. But
yeah,
it's not like he does a bad job anywhere.
I don't think he does an awful job with it, especially since he wasn't used to it. Mm-hmm. I also want to point out, though, how when in those scenes, he often just ends up looking at his hands. When he's unsure of where to look at. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if you know what you're looking for, that's a very obvious sign that he is not really thinking about he's not really sure as an actor where to look for the dragon. But if you look at it just from a story perspective, that can make some sense because he was a dragon hunter, swore vengeance on all dragons, and is now friends with one, and he doesn't know how to communicate with
Is it trouble acting, or is it an interesting character choice? Why not both? Why not both?
Yeah, hey, in my mind, you can use them for both.
That's how it's gonna work. That's how it's gonna be. But I still have yet to see any evidence to suggest that this man could actually kill a dragon. Like, yes, he kills a scarred dragon in a dust kerfluffle, and Gilbert the monk sees it happen, allegedly. But, like, what does this man have? He has, like, a sword that he hasn't polished in 12 years, and a spiked shield, because apparently he was built in D&D 3.5 edition, where spiked shields were a thing. But...
So, that shield is supposed to be made out of dragon skin. Dragon scales specifically, which apparently turn into leather after they're skinned off a dragon. You don't know why, but they do. But I actually forgot he killed the dragon at the beginning of the movie.
Oh, really?
I'm not gonna lie. Although I've seen this movie a lot, I just always assumed that was the first time he and Sean Connery, like him and Draco, were pulling the scam.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to see a flashback to them agreeing to pull the scam, and then we go back to the real plot. Because as a kid, the scarred one was only mentioned twice, and she was not important enough to enter my mind until the second movie, where she kind of became retroactively sorta important.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, no, I always thought as a child that was Draco, and we were having time travel moments in the movie, because we start in the past before skipping 12 years anyways. So rewatching it now and realizing, oh, wait, that's not how I remember this.
Oh, yeah.
This goes to show how my mind tried to make Bowen better at his job than what he was.
Oy. It's so... Because when he goes after Draco, it's like, okay, what do you got? What do you got? What are you packing that's going to take down a dragon? You have a slingshot with some bolas and a rope. Your plan was to tie your horse to a dragon and assume that the horse would win. That is it. That is if things hadn't gone horribly wrong, all the snaps broke. Your plan, best case scenario, tie my horse to this dragon. That'll take it down.
His first plan when fighting the scarred one was to make her land, and then he was just gonna jump on her in the dust.
This is clear. That the biggest suspension of disbelief is believing that Dennis Quaid is a successful dragon hunter at any point in his life.
I would like to defend I would like to defend the character Bowen in one aspect though, because there is one thing he is really good at, and that is clearly fighting with a fucking sword. At the very beginning, when you're seeing him train the prince, he shows how he's very competent with swords.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's not any of the flashy stuff you see in Star Wars or anything, I feel like it's more realistic to show in a fantasy movie because it doesn't have all those jumps and twists and anything. It's just a knight and his squire learning how to not die.
It's funny. My kind of like net impression at the end was like, well, I'm not sure how good a sword fighter he was. Certainly, he was a good sword tutor. That like the prince, who I couldn't believe would be competent in anything, somehow managed to beat him. Like that, I think just that alone, the prince beating him in a one-on-one sword fight, made me automatically like drop any credit I had given him as a fighter. I was like, no, no, if you lose to the prince,
That's interesting because I always took him losing to the prince as him not being ready to kill him.
mm-hmm.
Because he was so determined to find the dragon and to kill it. And if he killed the dragon, he thought he could kill the evilness in the prince and he would suddenly become a better leader.
Yeah. That's
which is why he was never interested in fighting the prince.
And
so I always assumed that was why he lost, and that he lost on purpose because he couldn't bring himself to fight like he had at the very beginning of the movie.
That is interesting, and I think that does kind of make some sense. There's a lot of like elements around that that like specifically hinge on the idea of like people around the prince believing that there was this corruption that happened to his heart, that something went wrong, that this wasn't already, the worst kid ever, which I guess, I think I would have, like, as a viewer, found a lot more believable if they hadn't been, like, every 30 seconds with the prince signaling at the top of their lungs, this man is going to be the worst. His aspirations are to be worse than his tyrannical father, whose plan to stop a peasant rebellion is genocide. He wants to be worse than that.
In the defense of his mother and Bowen, in the defense of them, real quick, of course they would miss that because he purposely never showed any of that in front of them until he was an adult.
Well, absolutely. It's just that, like, I think that
well, at least until he was teen. He was still a teen when Bowen finally realized, but
I feel like there would be more narrative tension if those, like, hints were restrained. Like, I don't need to see that. Let me have some suspension of disbelief. Let me think that maybe it is dragon corruption. Because from the get-go, like, you as a viewer know it's not dragon corruption, and the fact that everyone is talking about dragon corruption is just weird and confusing, because you already know that that is not a thing. That is just a genre element that is, like, a magical element that is brought up that you know isn't real. And so it's weird that people keep talking like it is.
That's fair. I don't know. Again, I'm a little bit biased because I have watched this movie so many times. And so to me, it makes perfect sense. Of course, Bowen would assume that because he doesn't want to assume the child he helped raise would turn out to be as bad as his father. His mother knows it's not dragon corruption because her people knew about dragons. So she doesn't even go there to think of that. She knows it's just because her son's horrible once he starts showing his true colors. But Bowen's really the only person who believes in dragon corruption, and he believes in it so thoroughly, he can't even bring himself to fight the prince. The most he can do to go against him is save a peasant's life and go off and steal money from his people.
There's a whole, like, I think I respect, like, the narrative, like, emotional impact that the idea of dragon corruption and the way that the prince changed sort of had on Bowen and on his mother. And I respect that in the abstract. In terms of execution, though, I feel like it could have been handled in a way that I kind of, like, felt more.
It definitely.
Because, like, conceptually, I am on board with that. I love this idea. I like how, like, the confusion that happens, like, the assumption being that what corrupted the prince was, this introduction of his heart, and not, no, actually, he was a bad apple from the start. You just mistook him getting power and finally being able to act on his, like, secret internal desires as a sudden shift in character. Like, you've just fallen for one of the classic blunders. That's interesting, and that's interesting storytelling. It's a pity that it doesn't follow through on that.
Yeah, because Bowen gets told pretty early on, right after he befriends Draco, that that's not what happened
Yeah.
by Draco, and for some reason he easily believes him, but keeps saying it's the dragon corruption up
Yeah.
until he figures out that Draco is the dragon who apparently corrupted him. And at that point, they're best buds, and he doesn't really want to believe Draco could be evil or corrupt an evil person.
You know, one thing that really doesn't add up, though, is Draco says that he is feeling corruption, that he is feeling like some reverberating nastiness coming off of the prince, and we don't really ever see evidence of that. And in fact, earlier versions of the script where like Draco's participation in the grift and is suggesting the grift, you know, in earlier versions, that wasn't because Draco wanted to do a grift, it's because he wanted to like take Bowen, this believer in the old ways, and like run him through the mud and say, hey, okay, you want to do nasty stuff? Let's do nasty stuff. Let's like grift poorer and poorer people. That's why the last town is a bunch of people so starving they like their first thought with a dead dragon is, oh my gosh, let's eat this. We're so hungry. Like that was the point apparently in an earlier version of the story. That's like an element that I think the novelization apparently brings up, that this is all like some meta like frizzling being done by Draco. But that doesn't make sense if he's feeling corruption. There's really no point in, there's no character beat that feels creepy but like the prince, except when he like makes moves on Kara. That is a bit like the prince, except he's Sean Connery, so that adds a weird element. But also he's really hot because he's Draco. So
Okay.
dang.
Let me give my view on that real quick, and then we need to switch to the next character because our 10 minutes on these characters are up. But basically, how I always took it is the nastiness he felt was not just the prince's wounds, because the prince keeps throwing himself on the front lines like his father, even though everyone tells him that's stupid. That is stupid. That's how your dad died. But also, like, there's moments where Draco is talking to Bowen, and he's talking about the other dragon slayers that have come, and he kind of shifts in tone, and it's too subtle for it to have been purposeful. It was most likely just Sean Connery, like, changing his tone and voice to try and make the dragon feel more realistic. But it kind of works with the idea that the shift in tone and music kind of hints that there's underlying emotions there that are coming from outside of him that he's acting upon because they are just so powerful. And you can kind of take that away as like it being the corruption from the prince. But besides the wounds, they never do enough with that for it to actually show. I feel like if he had been intent on killing Bowen from the start, and then after realizing who Bowen is, then he would change his mind. But it never seemed like he was actually intent on killing Bowen to begin with. So it never seems like the corruption actually does anything besides cause him physical harm.
Yeah.
But then again, we don't get internal monologues from Draco.
Yeah.
We don't get internal monologues from anybody until the very end of the movie. And it's just Gilbert explaining to us everything that has happened since Draco died.
Yeah. And there's definitely just this broader sense that like it feels like this story is like there's such a big gravity to a lot of the themes and elements of this story, and a lot of the stories and character beats and the relationships. It's so big, and and the truth is it's not bad. Like in the abstract, like we said, this is not bad at all. This is excellent foundation for interesting storytelling. If you're the sort of person that likes overly sincere high fantasy adventures and excellent relationships between dragons, and knights, absolutely fun stuff. Absolutely an excellent outline, excellent foundation for a solid novel, solid, I don't know, mini series, solid anything, except for whatever. Except for how it got kind of shrunk down and shoved through a Play-Doh mold for this movie, which, is not to say I didn't like it, but just that, like, it's so much bigger than I think what it ends up being. It's sort of, it's like looking at it's like a half-inflated bouncy house. Like, yes, it looks cool, but it feels like there's a lot of potential here that isn't being realized. That's a weird metaphor. That doesn't track.
A few more minutes to discuss Gilbert now, which I feel like we don't need a full 10 minutes to discuss Gilbert because he comes and goes pretty frequently throughout
Brother
the story.
Gilbert.
Brother Gilbert, the monk who studies Arthur.
This is Yaskier. This is the Yaskier of today. If you're a fan of The Witcher, this is the Yaskier, the dandelion.
Only he does not look as good as like Yaskier looks.
He looks
to
better.
Be fair, but he is like a 50-year-old man.
This is the hunter from Jurassic Park 2. This man.
He's like a 50-year-old man, and I think he's 100 in the second one. I think he's supposed to be 100 years old in the second movie. I think that's how long he lasts. I thought the second
one was a prequel.
No, the second one's a sequel, and then 3, 4, and 5 are all prequels, with 5 being the moment right before Draco hatches.
Okay. Well, well, wait. Okay, got it. So, 50-year-old Gilbert, Brother Gilbert, who is a pilgrim, who is like a Christian wandering around, big fan of Arthurian myth. I'm sure that is not something that's going to be a big part of what we discuss in this podcast. I love this man. Absolutely big fan of this character. I love that he's the Yaskier. I love that he's like following Bowen, reciting poetry that he's writing off the top of his head about his fight with Draco that is not yet finished, that he's panicking because he can't remember what he just said and he wants to write it down. Like, excellent stuff. Well done version of your Yaskier. I love the conversation where Bowen is like, you have the poet's gift of exaggeration, and he's like, you should see my histories.
I'm not gonna lie, my favorite part of Gilbert is the very end, when he's training with a bow and arrow, and he's like the first time he hits dead on the target, Bowen's like, beginner's luck. But the second time he hits straight in the middle of the head, and he's like, you're a natural, buddy. But he's a monk, and so he's not supposed to kill.
Yep.
So when it comes to the big fight against the castle, and he's fighting the king's men, what he does is he'll aim for places that won't kill them, and then he'll make a joke. Like, he hits one soldier who's riding on his horse in the butt cheek, so he couldn't ride on his horse anymore because he's got an arrow in his ass like Shrek. And he says, turn the other cheek, brother. And I love that. I love that.
Excellent.
Because at the very beginning of the fight, he's not firing at all. We know how skilled he is, but he's not firing at all because he doesn't want to kill.
Oh, yeah.
But he wants to help. So he's looking at the traps that they set up ahead of time to see which ones could he trigger without killing people. That's good passive character. That's good passive character, because you don't need to actively have him talking about it for us to understand why he's doing that. And there's the downside where he attacks the prince and tries to kill him right after because Bowen's screaming for him to kill the prince. And he's like, thou shalt not kill. But then he tries to kill the prince. That moment was a little confusing.
Really?
I keep calling him prince. He's a king. He's a king by the time he dies. That was a little bit confusing. I'm not sure why he jumped.
Really? I felt like there was a clear continuity there. I was on board with the ride there. I felt like this was very clearly like this big internal conflict. I saw it very like, yeah, like there's this, he doesn't want to kill. He's clearly effective and would be an excellent killer, but he doesn't want to be because he's like probably the second most religious person in this whole movie. The first obviously being Draco, who's afraid for his dragon immortal soul because he's not sure he's successfully, gotten enough forgiveness for his sins. But Gilbert, has this like moment where he has to face this horrible like moral ethical quandary where he has to look the face of essentially evil in his life in the eye and be like, am I gonna let this go, or am I going to kill this one person and break what have been my stated virtues and admit that maybe there is a rightness that is above even those? And I don't know, when he says thou shalt not kill, I felt like that was sort of there was a bigness to that, an ultimate admission that no, there's something larger here, and that I am sorry that I am breaking this vow and this rule that I've held so precious to me, but I am conceding that there's something about this mortal life and these mortal like plots and webs that is of even higher value to me that I feel like I could not let go.
That's fair, and I know that's what they were going for. But to me, he just stared at Enon, who is the prince / king. he just stares at him, and it's
Mhm.
Bowen shouting, "You have to kill him, kill him." Now, when he finally pulls the trigger, when he finally lets the arrow fly and pierces him straight in his heart. But my thing is, I wish it would have been something besides Bowen shouting that finally made him switch the switch.
Yeah.
Like, if the prince was the only person he was willing to kill, I would have liked to see him fire another arrow at another soldier without killing them to show it's only because the prince is so evil. Or even if maybe the prince had Bowen on the ropes again and was about to kill him, and that is why he let the arrow fly, because he didn't want Bowen to die.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
That would have made more sense to me, but just because it's Bowen telling him to do it kind of makes it feel like he's shifting some of the, not blame, but guilt off of himself onto another person who's commanding him in this fight, who told him to kill this one specific person.
You think that's
how it kind of felt to me, but maybe I was just expecting more, and we didn't get it.
Huh. I definitely felt like a lot of pressure coming off of him, that was sort of putting him and forcing him to make the choice, if nothing else. It was It was rough. I like the idea of having some extra, like, added, crisis, something to put, like, in front of him and be like, hey, either the prince goes, I'm going to keep calling him the prince because he's just that much of a loser. Either the prince goes, or, like, maybe not even Bowen. Like, I think certainly having Bowen be the threat would remove, the element of Bowen being the one to tell him to kill him and make it a thoroughly independent choice. But having, like, some of the peasant fighters be at the victim, like, it is a bunch of peasant people and the prince on horseback, and it is either save those, like, people, the people that you're supposed to kind of, like, represent and be here protecting ultimately, or kill the prince. And I don't know, I absolutely see how it could be better constructed. I felt like there was a sufficient narrative drama to add, like, a good heightening, which, a good full arc to him. Certainly not what you expect from your Jaskier. Certainly Jaskier doesn't get that. But it works.
He's a little better in the novels. I'm going to throw that out there. He is better in the novels.
I need to read it. I really need to read the tales of Dandelion and Geralt.
Okay.
So
Kara.
Yes. Oh, we're going to talk about Kara?
Let's talk about Kara very briefly. She's one of the only two women who have any of importance in this movie, and I do want to discuss them before we go on to our next topic. I know we're nearly out of time, so we'll keep this short. But Kara and Aslan are the two female main characters in this movie. Aslan being the queen who was forced to marry the tyrant king and didn't really want to be there or be a mother to the prince. She tried her best to be a mother to the prince, but she was willing to kill him when she saw how evil he had become, just like his father, because they both had abused her the entire time she's been there. And you find out in a brief conversation with Draco that she was dragged there against her will. She was the people of the Celts who was forced to marry a dragon slayer while worshipping dragons, even though that's not what Celts did. But okay. She gets killed by the prince right after she tries to kill Draco as his last wish. And the prince kills her in retaliation, and Draco is really, really upset because that was like the last of the good people in his mind besides Bowen and Kara. But then you have Kara, and Kara's actually really interesting. She's the person who accidentally kills the prince at the beginning, and the reason why he becomes immortal. And the prince knows that, because he memorized her face in the flames as she watched him start to bleed out. And when he sees her again, stand up to him with that same fiery temper and begging for her father's to be freed, he kills her father because death is a release, not a punishment. And that's a quote from the movie. It's his favorite quote to talk about death. And then he kidnaps her and takes her away because he wants to make her his queen, probably because he has some unhealthy thoughts about love and relationships and queen's duties, since, his father also kidnapped his mom.
Oy.
Yeah. But, she escapes with the queen's help, and then she
Mhm.
goes meets Bowen, and then she tells Bowen off for killing dragons, and then
Mhm.
she gets to find out that Draco is not dead. He's actually alive, and he's very, very nice to her. And Noah saw that conversation as flirting. I did not. I saw it as Draco trying to understand her and relate to her, because literally they've both been driven out and left behind by their people. All his people are dead, and she was sent there to be sacrificed to a dragon.
They have a lot in common. I feel like I don't know. I think there's a lot going on in their scene. There's a multi-layered thing going there, but I don't think you can look at the posture of Sean Connery Dragon and not tell me he's making moves. Moves are
I
being made.
I very easily can ignore that, but maybe that's because, like, the moment Bowen shows up and interrupts their conversation, Kara gets up to defend him, and meanwhile he's just like, Bowen, don't be angry. Don't go, Bowen. Come back. Like, he very clearly cared more about Bowen's emotions on the whole situation than Kara trying to fight Bowen. So, personal bias, I guess. I did not read that situation as flirting. I read it as the two having someone to finally talk to. Because Bowen's not good at talking to Draco
He's
at
really
all.
not. Which, is funny because they have the most profound romance in the entire movie, if you ask me. I mean, serious emotional intimacy between those two. Which, like you commented to me, doesn't help that all the romances are either creepy or not.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
They're all kidnappings or not actual. It's bad. The
kidnappings are
movie's
creepy.
not good with romance.
It's really, which, talk about Arthurian. Which, hey, talk about Arthurian.
Okay, so
I was sort of
I
surprised.
didn't want to talk about Kara, and Kara's a badass who
yes.
does end up leading the second peasant revolt against the crown prince and all of his forces. She's amazing. I wish she would have had more screen time. I wish she would have had more to do, but the core of the movie is really with Draco and Bowen, so I understand why she didn't have more. I'm so thankful they didn't make her have to get saved by everybody, though. There was like once or twice where she had to be saved from the prince, but everyone kind of needs saving from the prince, so I'm willing to look past those, and I think she's a pretty cool female main character. I feel like if the queen had gotten to do more, the queen would have been a lot like her. Because they two clearly have a lot in common.
Clearly. Lots of parallels.
For our Did You Mean That section, let's talk about Arthurian legend!
Now, this is the thing. I didn't know that this was like a post-Arthurian story. I thought this was going to be like, generic fantasy world, generic fantasy history, generic fantasy medieval Europe, That's why it's all white people. That's why it's all looking like this. No, actually, it says at the very start, yep, we're set in the 10th century AD. It gives like a specific date. And also, we're going to be talking about Arthur, which really threw me because I kind of thought that Arthur was a 10th century story, or at least that like that's how it gets portrayed when you go back to like the later medieval writings about it.
Yeah, but then it's the whole issue between later medieval writings about it and the early medieval writings about it when Arthur's name wasn't Arthur, but a different version of Arthur. And then you got to argue like which aspects of it are British, which aspects of it are Celtic, which ones are coming from the Romans. Where was the figure of Arthur actually from? There's a bunch of theories and ideas around who King Arthur was, if they ever existed, and at what point in time did they exist.
Oy.
And personally, for me, I hold the belief that King Arthur wasn't a real individual, or if he was, it was stories told about different individuals that became all about one once writing started to happen, and the story carried on from there. But that's not what this movie goes with. This movie follows the idea that King Arthur was a Roman soldier who came to the British Isles and basically took over and built a bunch of castles and ruled the area fairly and justly. But until Avalon fell, although they never really talk about why Avalon fell, I'm assuming they're going with the idea of like the war between Morgana and her son Mordred and King Arthur and the knights. They don't really say. We do know that they do believe in magic because clearly dragon magic exists, and then you have Gilbert who talks about Merlin and swears in his name or some shit in the middle of the movie. So this goes with the idea that Arthur was a Roman soldier who came and ruled until he died and perished. And the old code is a code that has been passed down from the Round Table Knights to other knights ever since. So if you're a member if you're a knight who worships the old code, which is what Bowen is, you're supposed to have more honor and be more respectable than other people because you have those Arthurian teachings. Which is why Queen Aslan clearly wants Bowen around and not like Brock or whatever his name was. She hates him. She wants him gone. He is very clearly loyal to Enon's father and a dick and a horrible person. And Kara kills him. But she loves Bowen, and she thinks if anyone can keep her son from becoming a tyrant, it would be the knight of King Arthur's. Which is why in the middle of the movie, when Bowen's decide he's not going to help the rebels, he hears a voice from King Arthur's statue reminding him of his vows, reminding him of what his knights are supposed to be about, and calling him back and giving him a call to action again.
So this sort of definitely, it settles it all in a very decidedly, and in terms of like how you thanks for the full rundown there. It sets this story very explicitly. This is post-Arthurian, both literally in terms of the time and also just in terms of how it's dealing with story. Here is the last remaining people that believe in this idea of, they never say chivalry, but that's the unspoken summary of everything. Which is funny because for being so Arthurian, it feels like they'd mention that. Maybe that's just too French sounding a word to drop.
To be fair, though, Arthurian legends were never really about chivalry, especially towards women, until later on.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, their chivalry was not about conduct to other people. It was conduct on the war field.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably why they didn't bring it up. I personally think that's a big take. But I think there was purpose to not naming it as chivalry.
I remember writing down the general vows, because it's never like I said, it's never chivalry, but if I can find it, I'll sort of bring up what are the things that they feel need to be mentioned as the key elements here.
To uphold your duty to men, to follow the code above everything else. As a king, you are more responsible for the code than any other individual. As a knight, you're supposed to protect the code, honor, valor, loyalty. I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the entire thing. Those are all the big bits.
Valor, virtue, defending the helpless, upholding the weak, truth, undoing wicked. Those are the big. Those are the big numbers. And it definitely is all sort of. It's not all related to combat. It is about speaking truth. It is about but it's also about, defense and fighting and virtue. It's very it is conflict oriented. So whatever interpretation that they are working of King Arthur, they're very focused on those in terms of how it relates to the use of power that you have. And that's sort of their idea of it. And it's really, I find it interesting. And like you said, basically all stories are kind of post-Arthurian because there's no original Arthurian myth. It's all reactions to older versions of the myth until the myth vanishes into dust as you go back.
Or you find versions of the myth that weren't originally connected to Arthur, but became part of the Arthur collection story.
So,
but happened to a lot of folktales where they would get passed down, and then you would get two different versions of the same story from two different people who were originally one, and then it became two different stories entirely. That's just how stories happen. Anthropologists track that stuff all the time. It's constantly changing. This is just how we grow as individuals, and so do our stories.
And this is definitely at the same time what sort of sets this apart from I don't know, the French, tales of the Green Knight and stuff, which were still building on an ancient myth. Even to them, it was an old set of tales. What sets this apart is that it's very, in universe, it is also post-Arthurian. It is in universe reacting to the idea of, the conflict between knights that believed in ideals and the modern world. The modern world being like 983 AD,
Yeah.
thereabouts, which is, I think, really interesting, especially because it's got a number of like elements. You know, it's not just the knights are almost all gone; it's the dragons are almost all gone, and Gilbert is like this one random weirdo who's looking for like evidence of all this, and it's very like vanishing.
I do think that plays into the Arthurian legend about how when Arthur died and Merlin disappeared, magic vanished from the world.
Mm-hmm.
That if you read the legends, that's typically when like magic started to die, and people believed fairies and everything started to leave. I'm being very generalistic. There's plenty of arguments against when people started to report those less, whatnot. But the point is, the story goes with that idea that magic died after King Arthur did, and that is why magical creatures are dying as well.
That's really interesting.
Without ever explicitly stating that.
I've never heard that element before, but I really like it because I like how very like it's very Mononoke. It's very like, and that's why this sort of marks the end of this. That's why that everything is every fantasy is sort of in comparison to this, because of course this marked the end of real fantasy, a fantasy that could exist in the real world. And that's very much what this story is also about. You know, the last dragon is dead. And with him, you know, it's sort of the last of this massive culture that predates humanity and also eventually, like, dedicated itself to humanity because God and Jesus.
Okay. Listen, they did not dedicate themselves to humanity because of God and Jesus. They dedicated themselves to humanity because one dragon did. And when he died, a new constellation appeared because that's their God. It's not entirely Christian, though it's pretty fucking Christian.
I mean, you know, when you're kicking around, like, conflating the same dragon, like, it's never made the same. It's clear that they are separate entities, but in the mind, like, in terms of, like, role in the story, as in, like, representing, like, the old magical ways that are going away, dragon culture and Arthur sort of fill the same void, even if, like, in terms of the actual, like, story timeline, they're clearly separate entities. It still very much feels, you know, to me, and especially given how concerned he is with his soul, even if it isn't explicitly a concern about going to hell, it's more concerned about void or constellation. It's still very like there's a lot of Christian-y vibes, even if they aren't explicit. And sort of like with Gilbert, with that sort of like dealing with like, you know, these conflated realities, like having to cope with conflict between what he feels like he really has to do and what his ideals are, and between believing these big poetic myths and also making big poetic myths and knowing that there's a lot of, you know, stretching of the truth that happens. There's a lot of Christian themes in this in this story.
But are we really surprised? It was made in 1996.
Yeah, 1996, about medieval Europe. It's going to happen. It's surprisingly unchristian, truthfully, if you think about the influence the church had around that point.
I am just going to say this. It does not have nearly as much Christianity as you would expect, especially with a movie that plays on King Arthur, since King Arthur is so often tied to Christianity.
Especially for a story whose Jaskier is a monk. Like, that's his, like, profession.
And
that's
is
his
a
job.
Christian monk. He's a Christian monk.
Yeah, he's got,
I'm
like,
pretty sure.
He's got the shell and everything. He's on the pilgrim path.
Anyways.
It's very interesting, and I like it. It's not quite the thematic depth that, like, I think was intended to be the center of the movie, but it is, like, essential to a lot of it, and I find it really fascinating. And those sort of stories, like Princess Mononoke, like, hey, Pompoko, I find them really engaging, and I love to see it. It's a fun melancholy moment, and it's, I don't know, interesting and engaging, and it's hard to do in a way that it doesn't feel antithetical to the kind of to fantasy storytelling in general. It feels like
that's fair. That's very fair. But we are at the point of the podcast where we talk about real events and people that influenced the movie, or came after the movie came out, or even before it.
The realness.
And while we have touched a little bit on it while discussing Arthurian legend, it's time for the realness segment. And this is going to require a trigger warning. We're going to be talking about abuses of power, rape culture in general, and especially how rape is depicted in this movie and where that depiction could have possibly come from.
Yes, and in line with that, we will also be discussing real world assaults and allegations. If you are interested in skipping, you can go to the time that is either being listed on your screen, or I will just tell you now. In editing, I will come in and put my voice in and tell you when you can skip to. But suffice to say,
it's safe to assume it would be 10 minutes from now.
Yeah, at
once
least.
we stop giving this preclude.
Yep.
But if it's any longer than that, we will let you know.
Yep. So, this is unpleasant, but in doing the research I did, I found out a number of things about the behind-the-scenes production. And like I mentioned earlier, the original creator was kicked off the project in lieu of finding somebody that the studio thought would be better, bigger, better named director to helm this and get the big money to make the big project and put in all the, stuff that they wanted. And, the person that they ended up going with was a director named Rob Cohen, most famous for like the first Fast and the Furious film, or like the third Mummy movie, or Triple X. And as you may know, if you follow happenstances in and around Hollywood circles, especially in the past few years, you'll know that there have been a fair few number of allegations of sexual assault against Mr. Cohen. If you go to his Wikipedia page and scroll down, you can find reference links that will lead you down to basically all the information that we used as the basis for our research. Suffice it to say, they seem quite compelling stories, some of them from people that are really close to Mr. Cohen or that have worked with him in the past. It is unpleasant stuff to read. It paints a picture of a pretty unpleasant man, if the allegations are true, which we believe accusers, kids.
Yeah.
It casts, not only does it just, leave a horrible taste in your mouth to read, it also casts an unpleasant shadow over any work that has been, touched and influenced by this person. And in this case, over this film, which is unfortunate because, for all of our teasing and prodding, we both have derived a lot of joy from watching this movie. At the same time, it bears bringing up, and because, look, why don't you say it?
Well, while this is not a news podcast,
mm-hmm.
we do dissect pieces of media we introduce to each other and consume, and that includes these serious topics. We can't ignore this, because then you go back and you look at the movie from a different light and you notice some of the weird stuff in it that could have stemmed from that kind of mentality and those influences. Yeah. It's the same reason why, like, if you read a good book and then you find out the author did something shitty, and then you go back and reread that book, you're going to notice some things that felt off before, but weren't as obvious until after you found out the truth. And while we are not a news podcast, I personally felt like it was really important that we bring this up, because this affects real world things. While this is a movie and it is a fantasy movie, people watch it and they internalize some of the stuff they see in movies or they read in books, and then they carry that with them, and it affects people. Nothing can just be consumed and entirely ignored. That's impossible. So,
and when it comes to these,
there's also, as you were saying,
when it comes to these pernicious elements, especially when it comes specifically to the topic of rape culture, an element that, as we've already discussed, comes up in this movie just, on its own naturally, as like, and it is in fact an element of like Arthurian myth going back all the time, centuries. It bears discussing, especially in light of seeing who was one of the helms on this specific project, because these tropes, as you said, they are designed to normalize these elements. They're designed to make it not seem as gross as it feels on the first watching, and pointing out and dissecting these specific elements in light of who made this is important to help identify, rape culture tropes, and to just, express how very not appropriate they are in any context, and also how the effect that they have in terms of how they impact this story.
So, as we go back to connect this to the movie Dragonheart, please do not think we are trying to downplay the real world accusations. They are serious. They need to be taken seriously. And I would implore anyone who is not easily triggered by such topics to go and read up on that so everyone understands what has happened or what has been told to have happened.
Yeah. This discussion, this analysis of the rape culture and these elements is our sort of contributing effort to point out the way that these themes and concepts appear in narratives and how those, as we've seen, tie into real world, the like serious, scary, unpleasant part of stories and how they're told, and what stories that we tell can change about our culture and contribute to.
And if you don't mind, I would like to actually start talking about how these elements show up in the movie itself.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so there's an instance in the movie where the prince does kidnap Kara and has plans to make her his queen, his wife. And he suggested as an offering after having already pinned her to the bed, and we see a lot of her clothes have been taken off. She's not naked in the way that you would see in modern movies, but she's in a state of undress for the time period that it is in. And we do not know if he raped her or not, but it's implied that something has happened. Either he undressed her and didn't go any further, or did go further, and this is the aftermath conversation we're seeing between the two.
And in fact, in an earlier draft of the script, as far as I can tell, certainly earlier iterations of the story, that was in fact the case. And the fact that she had been raped and had lost her virginity was actually an element of the story, like, and was tried to frame as some sort of impediment to her relationship to Bowen, which is just the most medieval nonsense I've seen in a long while.
Yeah. It's also pretty heavily implied that this is what also happened to the queen.
Yep.
Because she was also taken from her people. Yep. And while we see her as this regaled figure who has stood in the face of adversity and have come out the other end, her people are also constantly talked about as if they are figments of the past who no longer exist and are savages. And it really heavily plays on the whole Native American narrative in Western movies about how it's called the contradiction of the Native American, and it's how colonialists and white people still to this day see Native American culture as something that's ethereal and mystical, and they put it on a pedestal, while also like dismantling it and getting rid of it and basically calling it savagery. And that's basically how her people's also treated in the movie. So while the queen has also gone through these same things as Kara, it doesn't make them right. And it's the fact that the only two female lead characters have both been through this situation. It doesn't help.
Especially,
and then the fact, go ahead.
Especially like you're saying, these are our two female characters. Both are victims of assault. One of them is like got native coding, and native women, as you should know, have, a far worse, real world rate of assault, and victims, rate of being victims of assault. It is, very unpleasant to see that recreated in these weird fantasy stories, that are, that are for children. Like, first of all, they are for children largely. It is a bizarre element that they felt compelled to include, and just setting aside is just a weird, unpleasant reality to build that contributes to these weird real world cultures and impacts and viewpoints that have real world impacts. At the risk of being redundant, it is bad and unpleasant and gross.
They cause real world harm. They do harm individuals. And while I was a kid watching this movie and I didn't actively notice this stuff, upon rewatches, it's more obvious. And as you grow older, it's clearer how you notice these things. And so while we aren't wrong for like liking the movie, we have to acknowledge that these are elements that are just horrible in them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the fact that Kara is the main character. Is one of the main characters. She's one of them. And her only romances is with a man who kidnapped her and raped her, and is the tyrant king of a kingdom who killed her father, or the man who was a second father to the king
And is twice her age.
is twice her age and first met her when she was a child. While they weren't friends or they didn't really talk to each other, it's still the fact that we see her as a child, and then she's suddenly old enough to be dating someone that's over twice her age. And it's problematic. And I know problematic is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but this is actually a problem. And there's a difference between having an age gap in a couple and then showing them having met when one was a minor,
Mhm.
and then having a relationship when they're older. That's not the same vein as just having an age gap in a couple. That's not the same vein as having a character go through rape and then suddenly end up with the male lead who is so much older and was a father figure to the person who had raped her.
Mhm.
And we can't just ignore that. And those do have adverse effects. While I doubt anyone is saying this movie is the reason why they felt bad about themselves, it does contribute to that same mass media that produces these and causes mental harm on individuals. Yeah. So it has to be acknowledged and it has to be talked about. I really just don't know what else to say. It was shitty. It was shitty and horrible. And while the romance isn't implicit, it isn't explicit throughout much of the movie, it's still there, and it's still really gross and icky.
It is, yeah.
And I know that's not like professional terms, but it really is.
It is weird. The relationship between Kara and Bowen specifically is just bizarre, and it's a good thing that the edits sort of leaned away from that, because it was weird and unnecessary, and it stems from this weird insistence on, among other things, feeling like romance has to be a part of every story, much regardless of how gross and creepy it feels, and also again a clear disregard for how gross and creepy it felt in the first place. It was it was a weird element, and it was a weird element of the story, and it just another needle on this big stack of weird relationships that this story has with relation to women, indigenous populations, with rape culture in general, and specifically with this handling, specifically with
with the handling of women in the show.
Yep.
And native cultures, indigenous cultures on levels. They don't get Celtics, right? They don't even really care about understanding more about them or giving the queen more depth. And everything else we literally just said. There's no point in reiterating it all.
Yep, and we've sort of hit the point where we've kind of started to start running around a loop, because we've hit depression loop. Suffice it, we've hit depression loop, unfortunately. Sorry for bringing you down depression loop path, but sometimes you just have you find out something gross about a story that you enjoyed, and you have to do the time to recontextualize and look at the other gross parts and be like, yeah, there's a lot of grossnesses in this movie that contributes to other broader grossness. But but it's good that we've done that, and I'm glad that you sat through us with it. Hopefully, we're all the better for it.
Or if you're just tuning back in, welcome back.
Welcome back. So, I think that we've sort of hit up all the big points that we want to talk about with this movie, which brings us to the question, Taylor, what are your thoughts? This has been kind of a revelatory viewing experience. At least it seems from my end, for you, coming back and watching this. How do you feel?
Honestly, I still love the movie. All I didn't know about any of that behind the scenes stuff, because I don't really follow directors or actors. And I know I probably should, since I'm actively consuming media all the time. I just don't really care about what they do unless it's something really gross like this, because then it helps me recontextualize what I've seen in the movie. But beyond that, I still really enjoy it. This is still like my second favorite dragon of all time. The first one being the dragon from the Neverending Story. We'll get to him eventually.
Oh, we'll get to him.
We'll get to him. But overall, what triggered my love in dragons. When I was a kid, I didn't even realize there was supposed to be a romance going on. Because it just didn't seem to matter. And I liked that because I was tired of watching sci-fi and fantasy where everything seemed to revolve around some sort of romantic tension.
Mm-hmm.
And so realizing that there was supposed to be romance, I just didn't notice it, which, isn't uncommon for me because I often miss subtle romances. Oh, well.
Happy Asexual Day of Visibility, everybody.
Hey! Yeah, no, I just don't think about it unless it's explicit.
Hey, romantics in the audience, I feel you. I also noticed it and felt nothing. Or felt something and then never felt that in day-to-day life. But anyway.
But it's just... I still enjoy it, even though that is shitty, and those aspects in the movie are shitty. And it will forever color my view on Remus Lupin, because I literally forgot he was in the movie as the main villain. Because I saw him in this movie first, and then I saw him as Remus Lupin, and I, tried for years to remember where else I had seen the actor, and I could never find the movie because I never looked up on IMDb. So coming back and realizing, oh, this is why I was sketch of him at first. It was something. It was something.
It must have been something. This is why I thought Lucius Malfoy was an incompetent guy with a bad taste in hats. So, my thoughts on the movie coming to this, having never seen it, who's my main exposure to DragonHeart's media was a VHS trailer for DragonHeart's A New Beginning that I saw on some or other Universal VHS, probably for Land Before Time.
That actually would be coming out around the same time as those early movies, so yeah. That would track.
So I definitely my main thoughts on DragonHeart were soundtrack is awesome and dragons. That's a fantasy adventure. That's a lot of medieval people wandering around. Except for that one Asian woman with the fans in the trailer. I'm told we'll get to that.
The racism's even more apparent and really awful in the second movie. We didn't even
get to it in this one. It's here in this one. We didn't even have the time to get to the weird racism in this one.
We touched on some of it, but there's a lot more.
There's a lot more.
Oh, God.
It's suffice to say, coming to this, seeing the story, having only heard watched the Nostalgia Chick episode about it years ago, and having that be my main understanding of this movie, I had a great time. I had a fun time. It definitely felt like a cult movie, which is to say, not exactly good, but had a lot of elements of cheesiness or whimsy. The two ideas that are very close but also very separate. It had a lot of both, and I think ultimately, it had what all good cult movies do, which is a lot of interesting thematic stuff under the hood that are poorly executed but are fun to dig apart and talk about, and you feel smart for it. And that's really what media analysis is all about. I'm calling us all out.
You feel smart for thinking too deeply about what's being presented in front of you.
I spent too much time thinking about a dragon movie. Give me my degree.
If you've spent too much time thinking about a dragon movie, how far overboard have I gone?
They're gonna have to commit us both.
I noticed when they talked about Roman soldiers for the first time because it was a destroyed Roman fort that Arthur had built.
I didn't even notice the Arthur built. I just heard oh, the Romans built that fort, and that was my confirmation of oh, we're actually dealing with historical elements today.
Yeah,
but anyway.
No, they implied that Arthur had a hand in building all that shit.
Oh.
Which is why I say the movie supports the Roman theory of Arthur.
I see. Well, I said, fun movie. I'm glad that you brought it up. I can see why this would be a good bedrock for childhood adventure movies, and especially fantasy in general. It's the sort of film that I think I would have fallen in love with as a kid. I'm sorry that I didn't see it truthfully, except for the rape scenes. Rapish, implied it's suffice to say, except for the bad parts, I would have loved watching the good parts. And I'm glad to watch
Just a
it.
supercut of all of Draco's scenes and nothing about the prince. That's the good part of the movie.
And it's so gay. I hope that AO3 is chock full of Draco and Bowen fiction, because I felt the need to write it afterwards. I was like, wow, the relationship between these two is too powerful and intimate to be contained by mere 90s heterosexuality.
Oh my gosh. I want you to write that. And because you said that, there's now another series I have to show you at some point.
Oh, yes. Is it finally the series that goes there? Is it finally the series that's The Shape of Water but for dragons?
It's another one. It's another one where there's a close, intimate relationship between two male characters that are friends, but one of them isn't exactly human. But they have the closest, most intimate relationship out of everybody else in the entire series.
I've also seen Lord of the Rings, Taylor.
I'm not even talking about that one! Listen, I have a Gimli Legolas. I have several Gimli Legolas names, but that's not the point.
Well, I think that just about covers everything. Thank y'all. Thank y'all so much for hanging out with us, having a good time, chatting about all the nonsense. Ah, boy.
It could have been worse.
It could absolutely have been worse. Let's see. What do we got coming up in the pipeline for people? What is the fun stuff that people can be? Oh, hey, next week. I haven't even mentioned my half of Dragon Month. This is fun for those of you that are into niche science fiction / fantasy dragon-based novels and literature. I'm bringing in some Dragon Riders of Pern books. Because we're on a bit of a deadline crunch and I don't want to hurt Taylor, who actually has like big stuff and responsibilities to manage in her day-to-day life. We're going to be going over college. What can you do? We're going to be going over Anne McCaffrey's Harper Hall trilogy, which is a sub-series within the Dragon Riders of Pern books, and the sort of fantasy stories that you are going to need to read the preface to understand the context, because there's a whole lot going on with the Pern series. It is very much its own thing. It needs context. You need to read for the context.
I'm gonna skip it. I'm gonna read the context at the very end to see if I understand anything.
You will not. You will not.
Sounds like a challenge.
I guess it is. Oh my goodness. But hey, if you want to follow along, next week we're doing Dragon Song. We're gonna do the first book with Menoli. Meet her and her fire lizards and her terrible abusive dad. It's a great time. We're gonna have a lot of fun. It's bring your own panpipes.
I've got some violins instead.
Oh my goodness.
That's
I have
I've got.
A ukulele and a classical guitar and an automaton. I'll bring the automaton.
I have a classical guitar, a regular classic violin, and then an electric violin.
Oh, very spicy. Very spicy.
I used to be an orchestra. What can I say?
Ah, man. Well, thanks again, for the time, for the week.
The pressure loop has continued into the outro. I've been Tiger Eyes 45.
And I have, in fact, been Noah.
We hope you all have a great night. Thank you for tuning in.
Oh, man. I finally caught DragonHeart. How on earth did that take so long?
DragonHeart.
Ludicrous amount of time. It took a ludicrous amount of time.
Thank you for watching the video. If you liked our discussions on DragonHeart, please subscribe to support our channel. Likes are wonderful and greatly appreciated too. If you want to see these episodes get made before they go up on YouTube, you can find links to our Twitch channels in the description below. We record the episodes on both channels at 9 p.m. EST on Tuesday nights. So, what did you guys think of DragonHeart?